Okay. So today what I'm going to talk about is this is going to be the first part of creating the model of the economy. Okay. So it's called the ADAS, model of the economy. Okay, and so to start with, let's talk about the background for what we're trying to do. Why are we trying to create a model? So, as we discussed when I first talked about the macro portion of the course, we know that market systems go through this cyclical behavior. For instance, they may have 1 year, they may have increase in income. And so, if we mapped it out, for instance, we would see that it goes up and down. Okay, so for instance, we might put our nation's income over here, and I think I'm going to make this small. Okay, nation's income. And here we could put our year. And excuse me. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that sometimes it can go up a lot, sometimes it can go down quite a bit, and it might take a while to go back up, might falter. Okay, and so if I was to connect these dots that I have here and show the different years, the nation's income, you would see that there's an up and down pattern. And this is common with, market systems. They have this cyclical nature to them, where sometimes we have a lot of business activity and sometimes we have less business activity. And this is what concerns people, because when we have a lot of business activity, we end up with a situation in which the economy, whether you got people who there might be a little bit more inflation because we may be having too much, it's too heated up, or sometimes we could have low levels of business activity, in which case we'll have unemployment. So when we're beneath, are beneath the trend line, which is what I put in red, we have high unemployment. Okay, and when we're above the PPS, or above the trend line, we could be experiencing inflation. And as we've discussed prior units, what we talked about was that both inflation and unemployment, especially if it's unemployment where we have more unemployment than we have jobs, this is, difficult for the people who go through this experience, and it's also difficult for, it causes other problems in the economy itself. And so our government mandated itself back in the early, right after World War II. They just decided that they're going to mandate themselves that they actually ensure economic stability. And so, because they didn't want to see some of this ups and downs that we see in, in the economy, because a lot of people are hurt. In fact, this was done back just after World War II, when the people in our government at that time, most of them had gone through the Great Depression. And so they understood how devastating it could be. We had 25% unemployment during some of the worst parts of the Depression, and it took us a long time. It took our economy a long time to recover. It wasn't until the beginning of World War II, when we started ramping up for war production, that we actually started to recover from the Great Depression. So this really had significant impact on that generation. That generation that went through the Great Depression, they didn't want to see that anymore. And so this is why they decided that they were going to mandate themselves to actually, make sure that if there was anything that the government could do to prevent us from going through a Great Depression, that would be, we'd want the government to do that. They would make sure that if there was anything at all, okay? So that's why they mandated that. So now what we've done since I started talking about this, first off, let's just talk about business downturns. Okay, so now what we've done is we've gone through the first part. The first thing we need to do for us to be able to, or for our government anyways, to be able to ensure economic stability, we have to have some way to measure economic performance. And so we've been going through the measures of economic performance in the most recent units. And so some of those measures of economic performance include, for instance, measures of economic performance okay, and some of the measures that we've had, first off, we talked about measuring nominal GDP and real GDP, which is derived from nominal GDP. We have looked at different measures of price level indexes. To kind of see what's happening to prices, and the different price level indexes that we've had. We have the GDP deflator. We've used the CPI, and then there were a couple others that we talked about, but we didn't really get into very much, and the producer price index and the wholesale price index. Okay, so we had those as a way, and then what we would do is we would take these measures, these price level indexes, and we would see if there was, you know, we would measure the rate of change in those, measure the rate of change in the price levels. Change in these price level indexes to determine what's happening to prices, whether there was any inflation, to determine if there was inflation or deflation. Okay, so that was another set of things. And we also looked at, for instance, we looked at measures of unemployment, and we know that there are different types of, we talked about measuring unemployment, the unemployment rate, and when we did that, we talked about how the unemployment rate, we talked about the different types of unemployment. For instance, the types of unemployment being for instance, I lost track of what I was saying. So the types of unemployment include cyclical unemployment, structural unemployment, and frictional unemployment. And we know that the only type of unemployment that, the main one that, cyclical unemployment is the one that we get during a recession. So cyclical unemployment rises when we are below the trend line. So that's the one that we're going to look at and we're going to examine further. And then the last type of measure, we looked at growth in our output, economic growth as we call it. So the last thing that we checked was economic growth, which is growth in our output in real output. Output over time. Okay. Now, so we had all these different measures of economic performance. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take these measures here and we're going to start talking about how we can create a model that actually captures all of these different measures in some way so that we can see how they fit together. And so we can kind of examine what might actually be going on in the economy. And this is the reason why we create models at all, any kind of model. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how we're going to take these measures and we're going to put them into a model. So I think I'm going to just go and put these over here. And okay. All right. So we have two caption people here. Oh, okay, good. Thank you. All right, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to use these measures to develop the our model. And so here's, okay, so our model, we're going to think of our model of the economy as being, model of our economy is kind of being like a large market. Okay, so we're going to think of it as being huge, all the producers in the economy as being the suppliers, and all of the buyers in the economy as being the demanders. Okay, so we're gonna create a huge market. We're going to borrow the model of a market, an individual market, and we're going to use it to describe or model the economy. Okay? Now, it's not the same model. We're not talking about the same things, and I want you to get that clear in your head, because if you associate it too much with an individual market, you might kind of throw yourself off. You got to remember, we're representing the entire economy, okay? Not just some part of it, which an individual market does. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to adopt the model of a market, and we're going to use it for our entire economy. So here's the upper right quadrant of the Cartesian number plane. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about what we're going to put on our axes. Okay, so first off, what is, I love it when it does that kind of thing. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to talk about what we're going to put on the axis, because the axis is going to tell us what we're relating in this between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So aggregate demand, if you recall, when we talked about measuring our nation's output, we talked about GDP. And in GDP, we had two approaches. There was the income approach. So when we measured GDP, we took the income approach, and we also took and the expenditure approach. And if you remember, we put this in a circular flow diagram. Okay, we showed how in one side of the economy, all the money was flowing as income from what we produced, and then on the other side, all the income that the firms received was coming from the output that was purchased by people in the economy. And so under the income approach, we added up wages, rents, net interest, and profits, along with proprietors' income, corporate taxes, sales taxes, and depreciation. We're going to call that our aggregate supply. It's all of the output that we are producing of final goods and services in the economy. That is going to be our aggregate supply. On the expenditure approach, we added up consumption spending, government spending, investment spending, and net exports. So when we combine all that, we're going to say that's all of our demand, or our aggregate demand for the entire economy. All right, so if that's the case, and this is a market with GDP, usually when we have in an individual market, we put on our horizontal axis a quantity. So let's take a look at our measures of economic performance that we have up here. And when we do, we see the following. We see that we have nominal GDP, real GDP, price level indexes, we have the unemployment rate, and we have economic growth. The only one that is up there that really is a measure of quantity is real GDP. So that's the one that we're going to use as our quantity variable on the axis over here. So I'm going to go ahead and put real GDP on this axis. Now, for prices, we're going to have to take prices, something that represents all the prices in the economy. So that would make sense that we would use one of our price level indexes that we show up here. So the price level index, we have two main ones that we looked at. We looked at the GDP deflator and we looked at the CPI. The CPI covers the prices for all of the goods that consumers buy. The problem is real GDP has goods in it that consumers don't buy. They're bought by government, or they're purchased by investors, or they're purchased by people abroad. So we're not going to use the CPI when we talk about prices. Instead, when we use a price level index, we're going to use the GDP deflator for our prices. Okay, so we're going to have our GDP deflator. We're going to put that where we would put a prices in the model of an individual market. We're going to just put the GDP deflator. Okay, so now I'm going to call this, I'm going to put a title on it. I'm going to call it the aggregate demand. That's AD, aggregate supply model. Okay, so we have a title for our market, or our model, I should say. It's not our market, it's our model. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to remember what the purpose of our model is. The purpose of our model is to help us develop ideas of how to look at the economy to see if it's functioning okay, right? We want to know if it's doing well. Mainly, we want to know, for instance, if you look back at our trend line we have up here, we want to know if the economy is functioning too far above our trend line and we'll probably have inflation. And we also want to know if it's operating too far below our trend line and we'll have a lot of unemployment. So what we want to do is we're going to take this trend line and we're going to represent it in our model, okay? Because that's where we want our economy to be. We want to be at our trend line. We don't want to be above it and we don't want to be below it. So what does that trend line actually represent? Well, let's think about that. This is a trend line, okay? It's an average. I don't know if any of you have used a trend line. If you have used a trend line, you know it's an average of the points that are in the graph, right? So that means that it's an average of our nation's income at a given time. It's kind of a linear average, okay? And so if our nation's income is represented by GDP, real GDP, then what we're saying is that if the prices, if the real GDP is above the trend line, that means that we're trying to purchase, we want to buy more than what we can actually produce, because the trend line is going to actually represent what we can produce. If we were on our PPF, nation's PPF. In other words, it's the maximum amount of output that we could produce at a given time and with a given technology. The trend line is an estimate of that. So let me put that in there so that to help capture that. So this is an estimate of where the nation's PPF is. Okay, so when we let me just well, maybe I won't do it that way, but the trend line is an estimate of where our nation's PPF is. Okay, so our PPF represents the actual output that we can produce in the economy, right? So that must be what we can supply. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, so what determines where the PPF is? Is it, do prices have anything to do with it? If we were on our PPF, what would be the value of our output? How much output would we have? Let's say we have this amount of output if we're on our PPF. Okay? Then no matter what the price level was, we know that we could actually produce that. It'd be independent of that. It wouldn't have anything to do with our actual prices. So I don't know if you're, how many of you've used these vertical supply curves, or demand curves for that matter. They're a little bit difficult to get your mind around sometimes, but let's think about this. What it's saying is the amount of output that we have, and I'm going to call it Y because we call it Y anyways, black letter Y, but I'm just going to call it Y. That's our income, okay? Remember, Y stands for the nation's income, or income in economics. Okay, that's how much output that we could produce if we were on our PPF. It does not matter what the prices are. That doesn't change how much we can produce. The only thing that changes how much we can produce is how many resources we have and what our technology is. They're not in our graph. They're not in this model. We only have a price level and output. So no matter what the price is, we're going to be able to produce that amount. It doesn't matter. We can supply that. And we're going to call that the long run aggregate supply because it's independent of prices. So we're going to call it, or we have several names that we can give it. We can call it potential GDP, or we can call it the LRAS. LRAS stands for long run aggregate supply. Okay? In other words, what we could produce if we were on our PPF. And that's actually the goal. Okay? And that trend line that's in this graph up here is an estimate of that. All right, so let's take a look at our graph now that we have a couple of things in here, and let's start doing some interpretation. The first thing I want you to think about is that every point inside the graph, okay, I'm going to do a point here. So here's a point. It has a certain quantity of real GDP. So let's say that the real GDP at that point, let's say it is, let's say it's 12 trillion. The T stands for trillion, if you can see it. Okay, so I'm going to make this bold so it stands out so you guys can see it. Okay, so let's say it's $12 trillion, but it's not valued at 0 price level. It's valued at a certain price level that is at this point on the vertical axis. So let's put in a value there. Let's say that the price level there is 80. Okay? So we have 80 is our price level, and $12 trillion is our real GDP value. So what is the value here at this point? Well, this point here represents the relationship between real GDP and the GDP deflator, the two things. And we have an equation, if you recall, that tells us what that relationship is. So the relationship between real GDP and the GDP deflator. Our GDP and the GDP deflator is expressed in the following equation. Okay, so we're going to take that and okay, so what is the equation? Well, we have nominal GDP, or NGDP, is equal to, and now I'm going to, equal to real GDP, our GDP, times the deflator, divided by 100. I don't know if you recall that, but we talked about it when I talked about GDP. If you go back to the unit in which we covered measuring our economy's income, you'll remember that I went through the different ways in which we can express this relationship between nominal GDP, real GDP, and the GDP deflator. So what this is telling us is that if I plug in the numbers from the graph, I'll be able to find out what the nominal GDP is at that point. So NGDP here is going to be equal to, well, our real GDP is 12 trillion, so I can put that up here. I'm going to just show it to you so you can see it. So our real GDP is 12 trillion. Right? And we're going to multiply that by the deflator, which at this point is 80. And we're going to divide the whole thing by 100. So 12 trillion times 0.8 is 9.6. Okay? So our nominal GDP at this point is going to be equal to $9.6 trillion. Okay, so that's how we read our graph. All right? I hope that that's clear with how you interpret the graph, okay? Okay, so now that we've discussed that, now what I want to do is I want to discuss other parts of the model so that we can interpret that. Well, let's see. I'm going to do this instead. Okay. So let's say that for whatever reason the economy is over to the left. let's say the economy is to the left of the, right here. Somehow it's over here. So that means that it's to the left of where we would be if we were on our trend line, right? So where is it relative to our trend line? It means it's below our trend line. So if that's the case, this means we have less income than we would have, or less real GDP than what we would have if we were on our trend line or on our production possibilities frontier. Okay, so if the economy is operating to the left of the trend line, or the long-run aggregate supply curve, it means we are producing less output than we could be producing if we were on our PPF. Therefore, there is extra unemployment. Therefore, we must be experiencing and if you think about it, we're experiencing unemployment, but what kind of unemployment are we experiencing? We're experiencing cyclical unemployment because that's the kind of unemployment that we have when we're inside our PPF. So we're experiencing a recession, and there is high cyclical unemployment. Okay, so whenever we're on this side, on the left side of the ADAS model, we have cyclical unemployment. So I'm going to put that in there so that you remember that. I think I got it. Okay, so there was cyclical unemployment over on that side. Well, what if we have, let's say we're over here to the right of the PPF. Not the PPF, but we're at the right of our potential GDP. Now, if the LRAS represents our PPF, how can we be over there in the first place? How's that possible? That's the first question I ask. I don't know about anybody else. Maybe you have some other thoughts, or maybe you understand this better than I do. I don't know. But anyway, let's say we're on the left side. Okay? So if the economy is to the right, excuse me, if we're on the right side, if the economy is operating to the right of the LRAS, it means that we are trying to demand more output than we can produce if we were on our PPF. Then we could produce if we were on our PPF. So how is it possible? Well, this is one of the things that is a little different about the ADAS model, because the economy can actually be to the right at a given time if you look at it as a process through time. For instance, let's say we have a period of time in which we're on our PPF, but we're producing what we can, and we're building up inventories because there's not quite enough stuff, enough business activity to purchase everything that we have. So that gets rolled over into the future. And so what happens is the business, as business picks up, the business starts drawing down the inventories that they have accrued. And then they get to a point where the inventories are kind of low. And now they're in a situation where, well, they can't actually produce that on a sustainable level, the amount. But hey, they got a lot of business walking in the door, so they figure, well, might as well do something now while business is good. And so what they do is, instead of having their machines taken down for maintenance, they run them 24/7, and they have their workers work overtime. But, it's not sustainable, okay? So it's not something that you can continue to do forever and ever. At some point, what's going to happen is there's going to be upward pressure on prices, and so they're going to, people aren't going to want quite as much output because the prices are starting to go up, and so then we'll get this cutback in the amount of output that's produced. But for short periods of time, we can actually produce at that point. Okay, so more output than, so businesses respond to this extra demand, okay? Manned by having their workers work overtime. And machines not, keeping their machines running all the time. Okay, and this only happens for a short period of time. The problem is it's not sustainable, okay? And so as time goes on, the economy moves back to the long run LRAS, where Yeah. Okay. So what happens is the economy will start moving back to the long run. So what we can say then is at the long run aggregate supply curve, this is a sustainable level of output. I'm going to call this sustainable. Okay, we also refer to it as full employment. Okay, at the long run aggregate supply curve. And doesn't seem to be okay. The economy is producing a sustainable level of output. Or, well, it's at full employment. It's at full employment. So we'll just say that first. It's at full employment. And is producing a sustainable level of output. Okay, so in the short run, we can have so this is not sustainable. I'm just going to put that in there. And we'll probably have inflation. So this output level is, I'm going to have to, okay. Not sustainable. And we'll probably have inflation. Okay, so that's how I'm gonna leave it at this. Well, yeah, I'm gonna leave it here. Oh, I see what I did. I started early. I started at 3. Okay, so I have a lot of time, don't I? Okay. All right, so that's the first thing I'm gonna talk about. This is just part A. I'm gonna talk about, well, actually, no, I'm gonna go ahead and I'll talk to you about the AD curve in this model. And we'll go from here. So let's say we have, I draw another graph here. And okay, and I'm going to go ahead and I'll just put GDP deflator over here. so now we have our LRAS, and I'm just going to abbreviate that and just call it the LRAS. I'm not going to refer to it as potential GDP like I did over here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put the line in for our long-run aggregate supply. And of course, I'm going to label it again. I'm going to call it the ADAS model. And then I'm going to kind of find some more room for myself here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to talk to you about the aggregate demand curve, and so that that we talk about the relationship. By the way, I forgot to talk to you about this, but so we're going to start talking here about it. What would cause our LRAS to shift? Well, our LRAS is determined by whatever determines our PPF, where our PPF is. And what determines where our PPF is? Well, what determines where our PPF is our resources and our technology, right? So what's going to cause the LRAS to shift? Okay, I'm going to give you a brief account of that, okay? So we have the LRAS. I'm going to put this over here, actually. So the LRAS shifts, or we don't have them, is vertical, because prices are constant. Prices don't have any effect on what we can produce. Determine what we can produce. Okay, that's why it's vertical. The LRAS shifts due to any changes that would cause our PPF to shift, due to anything that would cause our PPF to shift. And that would be, for instance, which would be resources and technology, changes in resources and technology. Okay, so the LRAS shifts for any reason that would cause, any time that there's a change in the economy that affects our resources or our technology. For instance, in 2011, on March 11th, 2011, there was a major tsunami that hit Japan. And when that tsunami hit Japan, it knocked out shipping facilities, it knocked out schools, it knocked out roads, it knocked out power plants. It destroyed a lot of our resources, including people, which of course we don't want to, think about. But that's what happened in 2011. So in 2011, the LRAS for the Japanese economy would have shifted to the left because they had less resources with which to produce things with. Okay? Now, if there's an improvement in technology, of course, the LRAS would shift to the right. So anything that changes our resources or our technology will cause the LRAS to shift. Now what I want you to see is that we can also have changes in the, well, first off, what is the relationship with the AD curve? Does the AD curve, like for instance, is it vertical like the LRAS? Is it horizontal? What's the slope of an AD curve? Well, this is a little bit, I really, the thing with an AD curve to keep in mind is that it does slope downward, but not for the same reasons that an individual demand curve does. This is the aggregate demand curve. So I want you to start making the distinction. This is one of the things I had a very difficult time when I first saw it, understanding why does that AD curve slope downward anyways? I mean, it didn't make much sense to me because I figured, well, if you buy less of one good, well, you could buy more of something else and that would still be demand in the economy. It didn't make sense. If you buy, if the price of coffee goes up, yeah, you might buy less coffee, quantity of coffee, and buy more tea. So what the heck would cause the AD curve to slope downward? So this is a whole different way of thinking about things because we're not looking at it as substitutes for individual components. What we're looking at it as is the way in which the AD curve, how our demand is influenced. And so there are three reasons, so there are three reasons that the AD curve slopes downward. Okay, the AD curve slopes downward. Because there's an inverse relationship. First relationship between the quantity of real output demanded in the economy increases as, and the price level, excuse me, and the price level. Okay, there are three things to explain. There are three explanations for this. For this downward slope. Okay, the first one is that there's what is called, there are different terms for it, but sometimes it's called the real balance effect, sometimes it's called the real income effect. Okay. Okay, so this first one is the real balance effect. Now, here's what the real balance effect tells us. I really want you to see this because later on, we're going to be talking about shifts in the aggregate demand curve, and that's a whole different story, but it sounds like the same thing, but it's not quite the same thing. But if you understand the real balance effect, it'll put you ahead in being able to understand some of the things that we're going to talk about later. So the real balance effect, and I'm trying to see if I can find a good spot to put the real balance effect here, explanation, so that you can, okay. I'm going to put this over here. So here's my real balance effect explanation. So let's say that we have this equation, okay? And the equation looks like this. That we have money, the amount of money that we have in the economy, and well, let me see. Okay. And let's say we took all the currency, all the wealth. It's also called the real wealth effect. Let's say we took all the currency, all the wealth that we had in the economy, and we divided it by the price level. Okay, so we're going to divide it by the price level. Well, with all of that currency and everything in the economy, all the wealth, there's going to be only so much that we could actually buy with it, right? So we take it and we divide it by the prices, whatever the prices are, right? And what we end up with is that it tells us how much we can actually purchase at a given time, right? So how much of the output could we actually purchase? And this is the quantity of output that we could purchase. Could be considered to be determined by how much money we have and the prices. Now there's another piece to this equation, but I'm not going to talk about it right now, but you might see it in the textbook, and it's called V for velocity. But right now I just want you to see this basic relationship, and that is that the amount of money that we have, like say all the money you have in your wallet, let's say you have $10, okay? Let's say you have $10, and you go to the store. Okay, so there's $10 in your wallet, and you go to the store, and the price of bread is $2, okay? Well, we know that we're going to only be able to buy 5 loaves of bread with that money, if that's how much money we have in our wallet, right? Now, remember, the quantity demanded is based on the price level. So if the price level changes, we're not going to change the amount of money we have in our pocket. What we're going to change is we're going to change the price level. So in our example, that would be like this. We would have still $10 in our wallet, right? And now when we go to the store, we're going to see a price, not of $2, but of $2.50. So if the price at the store is $2.50, that means that we only get 4 loaves of bread, okay? So all we did was change the price level, right? We changed the price of bread, and it turns out we can buy different amounts of bread. We're going to keep our money the same, okay? So let's say the $10 represents all of the money all the currency, all the wealth that people have in their savings accounts and their investments and their pockets or whatever, all of that wealth, we're going to keep that constant, and we just change the price level. If you change the price level, you're going to be able to buy more if the price levels go down, if prices go down. If prices go up, we're going to be able to buy less with that money. That's what the real balance effect is. Okay, so the second one is the interest rate effect. And what that is telling us is the interest rate, what happens is that when prices rise, okay, prices rise, things become more expensive to buy, but it also means that it takes more money to buy things, okay? It just simply takes more cash or what have you to buy things. And because it takes more cash to buy things, this causes the interest rate to rise. So people say, hey, forget about buying stuff. I'm going to go and put my money in my savings account because, hey, I can make some higher interest on it. So when the price level rises, so does the interest rate. And people are buying less stuff as a consequence. Third effect, explanation, is that when the price level rises, we call this the open economy effect, or it's sometimes referred to as the exchange rate effect. Now, the open economy effect is that when the prices rise, like in our economy, okay, at a given time, they become relatively more expensive than foreign goods. So we buy more foreign goods, we buy more imports. They buy fewer of our things, so we have less exports. So we have what is called a net exports goes down. Remember, net exports is part of our aggregate demand, okay? So those are the three reasons that or three explanations as to why the AD curve slopes downward. Now, what might cause it to shift? So the AD curve shifts. Okay? The AD curve will shift due to changes in the rest of the world that impact consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, or net exports. Okay, so what are the changes in the rest of the world that, other than price level, okay? So there's going to be changes other than the price level. Changes in the rest of the world is something that's other than what is in the graph, okay, or on the axis. So what might cause the consumption spending to change? Well, let's say we have a couple of airplanes going into the World Trade Center. When that happened, a lot of people got really concerned about the future. They decided that this was not a good time to be spending money because they were very uncertain about things. And so they held on to their money and they stopped spending. That's one thing. We call it consumer confidence sometimes. When consumers don't feel confident about the future, they hold on to their money. Let's say the government decides that they want to increase spending on roads. that would be a change in the government budget, and that has nothing to do with the price level. The government might make that decision independent of what the price level is. So that would cause our aggregate demand curve to shift. Let's say the Federal Reserve decided to increase the amount of money in the economy. So let's say the price level is constant, and if we go back to our equation up here, if we go to this equation that we have up here, and instead of holding the money constant, we hold our price level constant, you can imagine that if the government or the Federal Reserve was to increase how much cash we had flowing around in the economy, that at a given price level, we could actually buy more output because the amount of cash we have has increased. And the reverse happens when the amount of cash in the economy decreases. Okay? We could actually reduce the amount of output that we could purchase. So the whole demand curve shifts. Changes in interest rates would cause consumers to be concerned. You know, say, hey, you know what? It's the interest rate has gone up. I don't want to. You know, I'd rather save my money and not spend it. Okay. Now, so anything that affects investment spending, government spending, net exports, and consumption spending that's not a change in the price level will cause the AD curve to shift. Okay? Now, let's say the AD curve does shift. Let's say it was to shift to the left. So we're going to have a new AD curve. Maybe the government decided to cut back on spending. They decided it was too much spending. We had to cut back. All right. So the AD curve shifts to the left. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our equilibriums. And as you remember from the model of a market, the equilibrium is where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. That's the same as in the ADAS model. It's where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. So I'm going to find here, we see that the original point of intersection was up here, and then it shifts down here. Okay? So let me see if I can make those dots more distinguishable. And so, okay, maybe that looks better. Maybe you can see them. Anyways, I used a different color than what I usually do. Okay, so that's the new equilibrium is below the old equilibrium. What's happened to the prices? Well, the price level has fallen. All right, so we have old price level. Here's our price level, PL1. And then we have PL2. Okay? So prices went down. What happened to our output? Well, our output in this graph, because the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, has stayed the same. It hasn't changed. It's an interesting possibility. So the next time when I talk, I'm going to talk about the different theories to explain the DAS model, and we'll talk about whether or not this is what actually happens in the economy. Because remember, the model has to explain what we actually observe out in the economy. If it doesn't explain that, then it's not going to be a very useful model, okay? So the next session I'm going to talk about the different theories, and we're going to see how this approach, where you have a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve and a shifting AD curve, what happens in the economy, what kinds of theories support that kind of view, and then talk about different perspectives on the economy that might need a different modeling, a slightly shifting model of the economy. Okay, so I'm going to finish here.